So the big overarching ancient philosophical question that we're starting with and that's motivating the project is this question of how virtue and well-being are related. And one way that I think when I look at the psychological literature, one sort of way of answering that question is to ask whether certain virtues or virtuous behaviors cause subjective well-being. So you can look at, and there's a lot of really neat research on these kinds of topics, you can look at whether expressions of gratitude produce life satisfaction, whether altruism or acts of kindness produce positive affect or lower negative affect. But the problem with that approach is that it assumes a rather narrow conception of well-being, and a conception of well-being that a lot of philosophers and frankly a lot of humans are not terribly, don't find terribly compelling. It's not to say there's anything wrong with that research. I think subjective well-being is a very important component of welfare, but it just isn't all of what it is. So we want to take a different kind of approach where we make some assumptions about well-being and also about virtue that allow people from very different theoretical backgrounds with different theoretical predilections to accept the results of what we're doing. So part of the project is going to be that kind of translation from these general assumptions to the different theoretical perspectives. So the assumption about well-being is that success in terms of at least certain personal projects is crucial to well-being, and I could explain, if you'd like, how various philosophical theories of well-being ought to accept that as an assumption, as a starting assumption. Importantly, I think that personal projects, or what I'll sometimes call them goals because it's shorter, and what I have actually called values, so I'm not going to distinguish right now between those different terms. But there are many crucial personal projects that require virtue to succeed, and in fact, they might require virtue in such a profound way that virtue is actually part of what it is to succeed in these terms. So I think friendship is actually a paradigm example of this kind of project. If what you value, your goal is to be a friend, to have friends, you need to be a person who cares about other people and who's relatively trustworthy and reliable. So those virtues are part of what it is to have friendship in your life. So here's what we're doing to investigate this large question. I can say something about the weirdness of the sample later if you'd like, but we're looking at incoming college students. We'll have self and peer report information about traits, virtues, well-being, then characteristic adaptations. We'll also use a method of personal projects analysis, and that I'm going to say quite a bit more about. We will look at this sample over time in 4 different waves. We predict an increase in evidence for virtue over time based on some other people's research that shows that virtues do increase, or virtue-related traits increase in college students. And we expect that an intervention will increase virtue even more. The intervention is the other thing that I'll say more about. It's the other method that is innovative, and I'll say a little bit more about that too. So that's the basic idea. And what we need to know, the information that we need to complete the project and answer the big question, we need to know a lot about students, the student participants. We need to know about their goals, how they conceive of them, how they represent them to themselves, how those goals are related, whether those goals involve virtues from their point of view, and how successful they are in terms of pursuit of those goals. So we think that personal projects analysis is the right method for answering these questions. It's a method that has a lot of virtues for our purposes. The main one being that there's a lot of open-ended narrative that's part of the method. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the method works. I realize you won't be able to read all this, but I'll tell you some of the important highlights. Personal projects analysis was developed and tested by Brian Little, who's a psychologist who's now retired. And the project has 4 stages. So the first stage is project elicitation. Participants are given a description of what a personal project is. Essentially, Little's definition of it is it's a temporally extended, personally salient set of actions that you pursue over time, a set of coordinated actions. But the participants get a more easy to understand description of what personal projects are and some examples, and then they're given a blank sheet and they list the various projects that they have. Some of the projects people list, this is a real example from a graduate student actually, are very specific, like lose 15 pounds. Others tend to be much broader and overarching and comprehensive kinds of projects, like the first one, become a good person. So that's the project elicitation phase. The next stage is project appraisal, where people are asked to score all the projects that they listed before on various dimensions. These dimensions on the top are from Little's normal instrument, and some of these dimensions on the top here would be important to us too, so we certainly would want to ask about importance. That's the first one. Self-identity and value congruency. We might also add some of our own dimensions. I think we'll certainly add one that has to do with the relationship between the project and the person's character. So something like, will this project make you a better person? In the third stage, cross-impact analysis, people are given this representation of their projects down and across and asked to rank or score how much their projects either facilitate each other or impede each other, or whether they're neutral with respect to each other. And in the final stage, the hierarchical analysis, the visual for that is so complicated that I decided to leave it off. But in the hierarchical analysis stage, people are asked in an interview setting or to write down the whys about why they have the projects that they have until they get to some kind of relatively terminal value. So why are you pursuing this and why are you pursuing that? And they're asked the how question, how are you going to pursue that goal, until they settle on a relatively specific plan. So you get a big map of the hierarchical structure of people's personal projects and the sub-goals that make them up. So that's the method of personal projects analysis, and the hypothesis is that, the prediction is that we'll find that virtue develops naturally in people in ways that are shaped by their goals and strategies. So to go back to the friendship example, the idea would be that someone who values friendship very highly and places a lot of importance on that as a goal and sees it as closely related to their identity and congruent with their values, that someone like that would be more likely to develop to a greater degree friendship relevant traits like caring about other people, kindness, and reliability, at least in the context of friendship. I wonder if I said everything. Right, the intervention. But we're also interested in whether we can encourage the development of virtue, and self-authoring interventions have had a lot of success in improving people's goal achievement in other domains. So we thought it would be worth trying here. The idea is that participants are first given a kind of free narrative space to envision their ideal future, and then they're given more guiding questions to move them along in that kind of narrative exercise. And some of our guiding questions would have to do with character and what kind of person they see themselves as becoming, not just what sorts of goals they see themselves as achieving in their ideal futures. There are obviously a lot of methodological challenges with this project. The biggest one, I think, is the coding of all the narrative data that we'll have from personal projects analysis and from the the intervention, the narrative intervention. This is Moyne's expertise. He's done a lot of coding of narrative data and developing coding systems with teams of people, so we're hoping to rely on Moyne's talents in this area. But I want to focus on the challenges of integration, one of which that I think a number of people have actually brought this up in one way or another, one of which is how the virtues will be defined and whether the three of us will have the same criteria or thresholds for these virtues. That's something we're going to have a lot of conversation about right off the bat. But the other thing is, the other challenge to me is how to preserve the relevance and interest to the big question, the big philosophical question that I started with about the relationship between virtue and well-being. So if we might have all this lovely data, and Colin's very excited about just having data, and that's nice, but then the question is, what does it show? Does it show that virtue causes well-being, that it's a part of well-being, that it is caused by well-being? And that's, I think, where hopefully the philosophical expertise will be useful, and we will have conversations about that. I thought I would say that the way this project developed is that, just to explain what the strategy for deep integration is, the way this project developed is that Brian Little actually knew Colin from various conferences and had read some of my work and knew we were both at Minnesota, so he sent us an email and he said, you two should get to know each other. This was about 3 years ago. So we got together, and we got together to drink beer and talk about his theory of character, his theory of personality, essentially my theory of well-being, our mutual interests in moral psychology, and we've been just having conversations for the last 3 years. And we thought it'd be nice to do something more, more collaborative and serious that maybe doesn't involve beer. I had thought that I could do a postdoc in his lab as a way of avoiding chairing my department, but the university wasn't too excited about that option. So then this opportunity came up, and it seemed rather perfect. But that experience of those conversations and the other experiences I've had with crossing disciplines, really, I think what I've learned from it is that a very important necessary condition for interdisciplinary collaboration is a kind of open-mindedness and trust among the participants. And I think that's hard to find if that has to develop over time. So I have some optimism that Colin and I have that, and I've gotten to know Moyne more recently, and it seems to be true there. It's a nice thing about this project, I think, that sort of open-mindedness and trust are rewarded, because I don't think those things are often rewarded, at least not in philosophy. I also, oops, I did say that out loud. So the other thing is that I really think, and I'll just have to leave the explanation for this out for now, but you could ask me about it. I really think that the right way to go, if what you're interested in is ethical questions, and that's what I mean by normative here, is to do with oughts and values as opposed to the psychologist's meaning of normative. I apologize for using that word. But I think if what you're interested in is integrated approaches to value questions or ethical questions, that the top-down method of deciding on a theory and applying it is the wrong way to go. So I'm inclined to think that you need to identify assumptions that are made by various theories, and that the process for doing this kind of research has to be integrated from the ground up. Thank you.
So thanks very much. So I have a question. You talked, Valerie, at the very beginning about the prediction about the virtue going up, but you actually also said something which kind of flabbergasted me. You said there's already evidence that it does go up during the college years, and so
right.
So I'm curious about two things. When does that upward trajectory start? And when does
And why did you miss it?
When does it end? No. But well, we're not going there. But I'm very curious about this, because if this is true by some sort of reliable measurement of virtue, then this is already like a lot of information we have about something that we're extraordinarily curious about. As someone who's sort of skeptical about progressive, either in ontogeny or phylogeny, about moral progress, I'm just curious about that. And doesn't that already mean that your prediction is confirmed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the 15-minute presentation hides a lot. What happened was Moyne made that slide and sent it to me, and I asked your question. What do you mean virtue? How can we say that? And then what turned out to be the case, and this Moyne and Collin both agreed on, is that agreeableness and there's evidence that agreeableness and conscientiousness increase over the life of a college student. But they also agreed, happily from my point of view, that agreeable and conscientiousness are not the same as virtues. But the idea was, there's at least some evidence to think that traits that are related in some way or other to virtues are increasing over time, which we thought was enough to say it's the best bet that what we'll find is that evidence for virtue will go up. The other thing is that what we're predicting is that the evidence will be affected by the goals and strategies. So the thought is that students who have high academic achievement and certain kinds of employment as goals might increase more in responsibility, and students who care a lot about being a good friend and finding a life partner, that different virtues might increase for them. Does that help?
Doug and Jennifer?
About your two different groups. And one is, why are you waiting until somewhat into the study to differentiate them? And the second one is, how are you going to select the treatment group versus your non-treatment group?
We're not waiting very long. Now I can't, and we could change that. So if there's a reason to do the intervention really quickly, we could. That would be some. I'll ask them about that.
Those time periods were not equal, right? So.
Right. Yeah. It partly has to do with identifying the subjects and when we can pay them to do which kinds of activities. But I'll ask Collin and Moyne about that, and we'll think about when it makes the best sense. Sorry, what was your? How do we choose? I suppose, one ought to choose somewhat randomly, right? So I'm not a psychologist, but I know that much. So is there a particular difficulty that you're worried about there?
I was just hoping you'd say random.
Okay. Pass that test.
Jennifer?
Thanks. I'm still a little bit unclear on whether you're expecting the self-authoring exercise to facilitate the development of virtue, or just facilitate the successful execution of their life projects, or whether you're going to actually try to differentiate those from one another, or whether you're seeing the latter as, in a sense, the former.
Yeah, so the thought is that it would facilitate both. There's already evidence that those self-authoring interventions increase goal pursuit. But so sorting out whether it has increased virtue, or sorting out the virtue effects from the goal success effects, is going to be tricky, because we actually think, given what we've seen about personal projects analysis, that there will be some characterological goals. So I want to be a more responsible person. I want to be more hardworking. I want to be nicer to my friends. Some of the virtues will actually might very well be in the list of people's goals, and then we'll have to sort it out at the end. Does that?
Will?
Yes, I just want to follow up on that. It seems like the key thing is to question about whether these goals and characteristic adaptations and traits lead to virtue. And what what I was having trouble seeing, and you mentioned it as a challenge, was, well, how are you going to know whether they lead to virtue? And I'm not really sure. It sounded like in your answer, Jennifer's question, that you're going to be using coding of the projects. Is that the main way you're going to tell whether they have more virtue later than they do earlier?
So coding of the projects would be one thing. If we hope to have peer reports as well, which would allow us to, if we can ask the peers questions about, especially if the peers are roommates, we can look at the participants' goals and ask the peers how, sort of in a somewhat more objective way, how the person is doing at, say, showing up on time to things and not sleeping in, or remembering to do the dishes, or things that would indicate increasing concern for the public space, or a social awareness, or something like that. So the peer report, I think, would help, especially when it's related to what the person's goals are. Does that make sense?
Okay, we had another question.
Thank you. I was worried about, how the way you've closely tied virtue to personal projects. Given that, you're going to have a random sample, and the personal projects might differ greatly, right? So let's suppose, people from two very different backgrounds, in one personal project, what counts as success requires, a lot of self-centeredness. In another, self-centeredness, focusing on what I'm getting. And on another, compassion is what is required. Now, both of them cannot be virtuous. So there's going to be some, tension in what the virtues are in this sort of, it seems to me, with tying them so closely to personal projects, you don't have an independent hold on what you want to call virtue.
That's a real worry. I guess that's part of my, I think the answer has to do with my sense that it's not the right way to go to have the right theory that that you then apply. So that it's kind of, sorry, I'm struggling because it's an awfully long story and Nancy's looking at me. But the thought, I mean, you're right that there are going to be projects where the virtues that facilitate or are an integral part of those projects are actually conflicting with each other. I guess I'm just not worried about that because to me, it would be very interesting to find out that, if every student or very many students have some kind of personal relationship as a project, the development of that relationship as a project, whether it's a friendship or a romantic relationship or a familial relationship. And if there are certain virtues that they have that do develop when they attend to or have attended to pursuing those projects, I would like to find that. And it doesn't matter to me so much if they also happen to have other projects that that compete with that. I mean, to me, that's the messiness of life, not a thing to be overcome, I guess.
One more question, Blaine.
There we go. I guess it has to be pounded before it works. Thanks for the presentation, Valerie. Really interesting. I followed Brian's work for a long time, and one of the things about the personal project framework is that it's relatively neutral to a lot of things, and in some ways that's a real advantage. So it's neutral with respect to a distinction, say, between instrumental projects like getting wealthy or getting famous versus perhaps a little bit more constitutive processes such as friendship or meaning in life, that kind of thing. But it seems to me that that could be an important moderator in your analyses. Now, I wonder if you guys have thought about looking at that in your coding when you code the projects. Second little bit of a follow-up is just to let you know how hard it is to code these things. I once spent 6 months trying and gave up, but so I hope you have better success than I do. But I'm more interested in the moderating variable question, because what we know is that the more instrumental projects don't necessarily contribute to well-being, whereas the more constitutive ones pretty clearly do. So, or they contribute differently. So.
Well, you do get from the hierarchical analysis stage, you do get a picture of which of the person's projects are seen by them as being, as you put it, constitutive versus instrumental. So we would have that information. I'm sure, so you're right that certain kinds of more terminal or end goals facilitate well-being more than these instrumental goals. But to say that is to say they facilitate, when you say they facilitate well-being, typically in the mouth of a psychologist, that means they produce subjective well-being measure stuff like life satisfaction or positive affect, positive and negative affect balance. And from my framework, life satisfaction is one thing we might value, and positive affect is one thing we might value, but different people might value it to different degrees, and so I'm not starting with that kind of assumption.
Thank you very.
Oh, okay.
Blaine is not most psychologists. Okay. Thank you very much.